I'm Chad McGehee. I'm the Director of Meditation Training at Wisconsin Athletics, and you're listening to the Mental Game Podcast.
Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Mental Game Podcast. Sam Brief here with you, and back. Thanks for your patience. Little 1 month hiatus. I was off working the Olympics, which was an amazing experience. But now it's mental game time. Time to refocus here, and we have a golden guest today making a repeat appearance. He's part of the Two Timers Club, Chad McGehee, the Director of Meditation Training at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And he was a history maker, a trailblazer 3 years ago in the heat of COVID. Wisconsin took a leap of faith. They hired him to this position, which was the first of its kind in major college sports. There was no blueprint. No one had done this job before, and Chad plunged in. I had him on the podcast at the very beginning of it when he was just getting his feet under him, figuring out what the lay of the land would be like. And now he's a veteran. He's been doing this thing for 3 years, and a ton has changed. Conference realignment, NIL legislation. College athletes can make money now. Yippee! But it's a lot to think about. And Chad, as the Director of Meditation Training, all about mindfulness. He's on the cutting edge of it and is also leading some pretty groundbreaking research. So if you're a nerd about this stuff, I think you'll love this podcast. And if you're not, then I still know you'll love this because he gives us so many little nuggets of advice, amazing stories too, about his experiences working up in Madison that I know you will love for the next 30 minutes. So without further ado, let's go up north to Madison, Wisconsin, and check in with the first ever Director of Meditation Training at Wisconsin, Chad McGehee. It's coming up on the Mental Game in 3, 2, 1. Welcome back to the Mental Game.
Great to be here, Sam. Excited for our conversation.
Yeah, great to have you again at an interesting time in college sports, and we will dive into all of it. But I want to start with you. What's life like in late August for someone who's in the trenches at a major Division I athletic department?
Yeah, it's go time, right? Like we are, fall sports are underway. We've got, men's soccer has a game tonight. Volleyball had their first scrimmage this week. Football's winding down camp. Fall sports are going. It's happening. And of course, winter sports, there's a little bit of a time off right now, and then the semesters get started and they're going to be back. So it is throttle down time in college athletics, but a tremendous amount of excitement. Someone was our athletic director actually was talking about this. And if you work in college sports, our fall has that spring feeling, right? Spring, always eternal. There's hope, optimism, new things ahead. And that's what fall feels like in college athletics, right? Everybody's 0-0. Lots of possibilities ahead of us.
Right, and it's still summer. I mean, you're in Madison. I'm here in Chicago. It's August. It's hot. It's sunny. But fall sports are happening. Time to buckle up. Giddy up. Chad, last time we talked, it was just the start of this journey for you. You had been hired 8 months before as the first ever Director of Meditation Training at a major college athletic department. That was history making. You were starting this journey, first time ever, no real blueprint or game plan for people who had done it before. And now I'm talking to you 3 months or 3 years later. A lot has happened since. So catch me up a little. What's life like right now?
Things have really progressed over these past 3 years in a lot of exciting ways. I think, one of the unique things about this position that I have is that it's both training and research. And we've had major developments on both sides of things. So kind of on the training side of things, the work is so much more integrated. We've got so many more success stories. We've been able to collaborate, this work with strength and conditioning, mental health work, sport coaches, and so many different ways. And then on the research side, we've been able to publish. We've got a couple research papers out that are really cool. We can talk about those and a bunch more on the way. So the work's really matured, but what hasn't changed is kind of the drive, the curiosity, and the possibility to continue to grow. While we are now 4 years into this thing, it still feels like we're just scratching the surface.
You seem really excited about some of this research, and I know you're on the cutting edge of so much of it at this sort of incubation, this amazing place where things are changing constantly. So let's hear, out of all that research, what comes to mind? What's the top thing that you're so excited to talk about?
Yeah, the research, we have just an incredible opportunity at a major university like Wisconsin with a high performing athletic department and high performing researchers all over the place. So that collaboration is really exciting. But we had a paper published this winter, Sam, that's unbelievable. And in this paper, what we did is we looked at, strength coaches ask questions every day to their athletes about kind of like how they're doing physically. And the strength coach for this program started asking, did you do a mindfulness practice this day? So then we could look and see, is there a relationship between some of these physical outcomes and doing a mindfulness practice? And what we see, there's two major findings. The first major finding is on the days that these athletes did a mindfulness practice, they had statistically significant improvements in mood, muscle readiness, energy level, and readiness to train. Same day, they were better in these categories. So I think we can think about those as like foundational performance factors. And then we're showing that with mindfulness and meditation training, we can tick those up. Whereas typically in periods of intensity, those tend to go down. So that's really exciting. That's a competitive advantage. But then the other finding out of this paper is we looked at sports med data, in particular acute injuries. And what we saw was there was after the day after doing a mindfulness practice, these athletes had a reduction in the incidence of acute injury by 58%. Yeah,
Wow.
it's a jaw-dropping number.
You're looking at my jaw.
Yes. And it is this sort of number, Sam, that changes the way that sport is trained forever. There are caveats and there's things we need to consider, as we think about that number, and that number is going to change. But I think both of those research findings show by including this training in a foundational way, we get not only the mental benefits that we tend to think of with meditation training, but of course the mind and the body is one system. So some of these benefits show up in the physical domains as well.
So tell me if I'm regurgitating this correctly, which is that a student athlete who's done mindfulness training is performing better in strength and conditioning and is significantly at a reduced physical injury risk just by virtue of doing the mindfulness training. Yeah?
That's what these data are suggesting.
Ooh.
Exactly.
That's big stuff. And that number, 58%, that's chunky. What does that tell you about your work?
It's a massive number, man. I mean, like, it's unbelievably exciting. And it lets me know that, I mean, when we first started doing this work, we weren't doing it with the motivation that we think this can help us reduce the incidence of injury. That wasn't the intention. It just so happened that it had that impact. And there is other stuff in the literature that says, injury reduction can happen as a result of mindfulness training. But to have a number that big at this level of athlete, where, of course, in sport, we say all the time, your best ability is availability. Anything we can do to reduce the likelihood of injury is going to be extremely important, right? Whether that's recovery modalities like, cold tubs or, supplements or whatever we're doing, right? So I think that's the number that's going to get a lot of people to express interest and curiosity. And that's just the tip of the iceberg of the benefits. So that gets me really excited.
Explain to me how that works. How does me doing a mindfulness training right now make me less likely to get injured on my morning run tomorrow?
Yeah. So this is, so scientifically, we don't know, right? Like that's where future research is going to have to investigate that, right? So we think about those as mechanisms, right? Like what's the mechanism that's actually changing that's result in this reduction of injury? But we got some ideas on like what that could be. So one of the ideas could be related to attention. We know mindfulness training is really good at training attention to be where we want it to be. And when someone's distracted, they're probably more likely to get injured, whatever that injury is, right? So that's one possible reason, right? Attention is where we want it to be. We're less distracted, less likely to get injured. Another unique thing about mindfulness training is inherently embodied. It's not just a set of cognitive activities or mental skills. it is very much an embodied practice. So we have increased body awareness of what's going on in our body. Scientifically, we call it proprioception. And that gives an athlete then the ability to maybe notice. You wake up tomorrow morning before you run and you're like, my hamstring's a little tight or whatever it is, right? And maybe you just do a little bit of foam roller, right? Or maybe you take it easy, or maybe you don't do like a hill workout that you had planned or something, right? But the mindfulness, the proprioception gives you the ability to have access to that information about your body that you may not otherwise have. So that's really important. A third thing that may be driving it is we know that kind of mindfulness training and meditation training is a really powerful way to work with stress and accumulated stress. And of course, like accumulated stress compounds over time that ultimately is going to get stored up in the body that could show up as an injury. So having ways to kind of metabolize that stress, dissipate that stress in an ongoing way could, be a factor too. So those are some ideas as to why we see a number like that show up.
Yeah, those are all fascinating, and they all feel valid and that they're probably working together to accomplish the injury reduction. I'm really intrigued by your second point about the concept of proprioception, right?
Mm-hmm.
The awareness of the body and how that can help. Just the concept of waking up and saying, okay, my hamstring's a little funky. Maybe I do X instead of Y. Maybe I stay in bed because it really hurts. If we're too distracted, if we don't notice our body, we might just truck through that. Next thing you know, you have a torn hamstring, you're in the hospital. So can you explain that concept a little more of proprioception?
Yeah, it's really interesting. So it's kind of this notion of being aware of the body by feeling it in the body. So as instead of thinking about what's going on in the body via our mind, right? Like so that's a huge difference, right? If we think about it from the perspective of even an athlete learning to develop a new skill, we spend so much time on the technique, right, of whatever that skill is, hand placement, hip placement, all these sorts of things. And coaches are doing all these things. And they're telling the athlete with words, which are just ideas. And then the athlete's supposed to feel that in their body. And then hopefully at a certain point, it's just, kind of locks in and they can feel it in their body. Well, if they have a greater ability to know what's going on in their body as it's happening, and that's like an important thing, that's the mindfulness part, as it's happening, then when the coach says, like, open your hips up a little bit to the left, then they can really feel what that's like. And then boom, they've got it now. They no longer need the idea of open my hips up in a certain way. They can feel it in their bodies. And so that's part of the skill we're developing. The other way I think that shows up in injury we talked about, kind of skill acquisition we just talked about there, but also in terms of performance. Athletes don't perform their best when they're thinking about what they're doing while they're doing it, right? Like there's an automaticity to it, right? They're in their bodies while they're doing it, and that allows them to be spontaneous, right? Kind of respond to what emerges. And that's a skill we can develop. We can actually get better at that. There's a time and a place to be thinking about stuff, and there's a time and a place to just be in your body and let it rip.
Be in your body and let it rip. I think about watching the greats, right? Watching Michael Jordan in the fourth quarter taking over in the NBA Finals. He's not thinking about his technique on every dribble and every pass and every shot, right? He's reading and reacting to the defense, and he's focusing on the moment because his body just seems like it's an auto drive. Is that right?
Absolutely. And of course, there's a certain level of competence, physical competence that's required to be able to do that, right? So like Michael Jordan had the skill set to be able to do that, right? So like athletes still need to put in the time to be able to physically do what it is that they need to do. But then it's in those moments, how many athletes get caught in the fourth quarter and are thinking about like, oh, I hope I don't miss this shot. It was a big one, right? Or last time I had this opportunity, this is what happened. Or haven't been shooting the best, right? Like maybe I should. And it's just thinking. A little bit of that we want to do, right? We want to kind of see what the other team is doing. But then ultimately, it's just get out there and just trust. Let the body do what the body knows how to do.
I feel like this whole time we've been just brushing aside the whole concept of mindfulness as this big chunk. It feels like listening to a 5-star chef talk about his favorite recipe, but he hasn't actually taught me how to do the recipe yet. Now, I'm not asking you to bottle up your whole job and just tell me in 2 minutes, but for listeners who might not be too familiar with the concept of mindfulness, what does it look like if I'm a Wisconsin student athlete and I sit down and I work with you and I say, Chad, teach me your ways. I want to be more mindful.
Yeah. So the way we think about it, kind of at a conceptual level, is we talk about it as the five foundations of meditation training. And so these are five kind of skill areas that we can develop in. Just like, to use your example, if a student athlete sat down with a strength coach, the strength coach would say, well, there's certain areas we're going to explore, right? We're going to explore power, endurance, speed, it's similar in meditation training. So our kind of the five areas that we think about or kind of organize the training around is attention, meta awareness, decentering, connection, and purpose. And so each one of these are kind of like discrete areas. But of course, at the end of the day, just like strength and conditioning training, an athlete's not out on the field being like, I need to be powerful now. No, they're just being athletic, right? So similarly, at the end of the day, with this training, those five come together in such a way that the athlete's just able to perform in the moment in a way that makes sense for them.
And are we doing actual meditation practices together? Are there apps you work with? Are you giving me things to do at my dorm room or apartment by myself? What does that look like?
Yeah, for sure. So what we're doing is in each one of those areas, and especially depending on what's going on with the athlete is we have to dial this into what's making sense for that athlete, right? So I'm asking a lot of questions, right, to understand what's going on for them so I can provide the best training. But then once we have that, then, the athlete needs to make sure I need to make sure that they understand the concepts around the training. For example, with something like attention, they need to understand that attention is a skill and it's a skill we can train. It's something we can get better at. The way we get better at it is by meditating, is by practicing. So then that could look a bunch of different ways, right? Like maybe that athlete's doing it in a stillness practice. Maybe they're taking 3 minutes at the end of the day to do a breath awareness practice, or maybe they're doing it integrated into an existing activity while they're walking into the facility. They're feeling their feet make contact with the floor, or maybe during dynamic warm-ups, they're kind of feeling their body start to move. And through all of that, we can notice, where's my attention? When does it wander off? And then I can bring it back to where I want it to be. So they have intentional times where they're training to be able to bring that into their lives. And then just like any coach, we're meeting and then talking regularly. So what's happening? How's it going? One of the tricky things with meditation is you can't just like watch film to see what's happening in someone's mind. They have to tell you what's happening in their mind. So we have conversations, right, to be able to see what's going on and then dial that training in every week.
When I have you on the mental game in 2100, maybe we'll be able to read the minds, right? That'll be the next step. How do you read minds and learn what student athletes are thinking?
Totally, man. I look forward to that one.
That's 3.0, but we're still in 2.0. I want to touch on this concept of distraction because, oh my God, I can't even imagine how many distractions a major D1 student athlete has. You already have the pressures of class and actually performing well in your sport and all that. But on July 1st, 2021, you have this whole bucket of NIL flooding college sports, which is great for student athletes in that they can finally get money for what they are worth. They can finally market themselves on the free market like I can, like you can. But suddenly all your time is money. Suddenly people are knocking at your door, giving you opportunities, and the distractions are literally 24/7, 365. So what's the distraction level like of these athletes you're working with?
So I think in general, we could consider that we live in an attention deficit society, that it is pervasive and constant, and in many ways considered normal, right? There's a new normal of constantly being distracted, of any moment of not full engagement, like reach for devices. And I'm not anti-devices either, right? We can do lots of cool things, but one of the things that happens is our attention is just pulled in so many different directions, and there's lots of forces, lots of people who are vying for our attention. And so what I think is in the midst of that, if we're not taking the time to train our minds to know where our attention is and then be able to redirect it to where we want it to be, then we're just leaving it up to other people to direct our attention where they want it to be. So the mindfulness and meditation training puts us in a really powerful position, regardless of the circumstances. And then one of the unique circumstances for current student athletes is, like you're saying, NIL, right? And all the other things that are coming. But I do want to broaden it out past that, right? Like this is just for any human being, wherever they're at. Like this skill set is important. But a unique one for student athletes is navigating this new environment, which you say is really important, and it's wonderful, and they can benefit from this in all these cool ways. But just like there's a time and a place to reflect on their athletic performance, and then they got to let it go to be ready for the next one. They have to be able to let go of potential NIL deal so they can transition into the facilities. And a foundational skill to be able to do that are the skills of attention and mindfulness.
What I'm hearing from you is I'm not going to get rid of this device, this iPhone and the computer I've got in front of me and the demands that might come to me. In the modern world, there's no getting rid of that, but it's the ability to pick and choose, to shut out everything else when you have to lock in on the prize. Is that right?
I think that's a huge part of it. Absolutely. I think, one of the kind of philosophies that, I take from the meditation traditions, contemplative traditions is, we're going to end up in a world of hurt if we try to make the world conform to the way we want it to be so that we can be happy. Not how it's going to work, right? The world's going to do what the world's going to do. And we're not doormats either, right? Like if we can influence something for the better, we should, right? And we, in many ways, are compelled to, depending on particular issues. And at the same time, there's lots of things that are out of our control. Like if you're a student athlete, you don't control whether or not NIL exists. You do control how you want to engage in it, how it's going to impact you, and whether how it's impacting you is ultimately beneficial for you or not. And then, of course, that's an individual user question. And I'm not really interested in what an athlete chooses to do in that space or not. What I'm interested in is giving them the skills in their own minds to be able to navigate that process more skillfully.
World's gonna world, you do you.
Love it. Absolutely.
If only more people could follow that policy, right?
Yeah, totally. It's hard to do, man. And that's why we practice.
Exactly. I'm curious now that the first time we talked, you were barely 6 months into the job at Wisconsin. Now you're almost 3 full years in. So what's buy-in been like among student athletes, among coaches, and I know there have been a few coming in and out, among athletic director at Wisconsin?
Yeah, I would say one of the benefits we have is from an athletic director point of view, and I think is one of the unique things about being able to do this work at Wisconsin is Chris McIntosh is the athletic director at Wisconsin, and he was actually a part of pilot training that we did 7 or 8 years ago with a group of retired NFL guys. And it was actually, everyone calls it Mac. It was actually Mac's idea to say, hey, he asked me if I would ever be willing to come share this with current student athletes. And that's how we started back in the day, really small. And then eventually over a number of years, it developed into something where I saw there was a there, the athletic department saw there was a there, and then they created the position that I had, now almost 4 years ago. And then the, Mental Game podcast, 3.5 years ago. And so from a corner office perspective, I think that matters, right? Because he saw the possibility and before maybe other people could see it. And that's what good leadership is. So that remains steady. He continues to see all the unique ways that it can show up. But then from a more basic level, like with coaches and athletes, I think, Sam, what happens is coaches are interested in success. So how is this going to make us better? And now we have evidence, not only the scientific evidence, right, that we talked about before, but real world evidence. So an example of this is in the 2021 volleyball national championship. So this is 9 months after you and I spoke. Our team's playing Nebraska, storied rival, go to 5 sets. Thought we'd won the national championship. Team storms the floor. The Nebraska coach challenges the call. Our team has to return to the sideline. Confusion, ambiguity, worry. They talked about in those moments doing the practices that we'd been training for, feeling their feet on the court, feeling the breath roll in and out, tracking racing thoughts and emotions, letting them settle so that when they took the floor again, they did so with a sense of steadiness, a sense of presence. And then won the second national championship point, bringing home the first national championship in program history. Now, to be abundantly clear, they didn't win it because of mindfulness and meditation. They won it because of thousands of hours of dedication and hard work. All this training did was allow them to reliably unleash those potentials in the moments that mattered the most. So we see examples like this start to happen, where we've got this combination of scientific evidence in real world. This is what happens in high performing groups that just continues to generate, more interest from athletes, more interest from coaches.
It's amazing. The volleyball example, and a crystal clear example of quick 30-second mindfulness paying off, right? We don't, I think so many people think of the concept of meditation and mindfulness as I'm shaving my head and going to Tibet and becoming a monk and dedicating my life to this. No, it can be a 30-second breath work in the moment, in the heat of national championship match point, that actually makes the difference. That's a beautiful example, and a championship example.
Absolutely. It's, everything you just said, I completely agree with. And I'll say that from a training perspective, those 30-second practices are only made more powerful by doing a little bit more practice outside of that. So we don't want to wait for the most intense moments to do our meditation. We kind of want to practice beforehand. And this is where that strength and conditioning metaphor works again, is you don't, wait until the national championship point to say, you know what, I should have worked on like my vertical leap this summer a little bit more. No, right? Like you execute it in those moments because you've done all the work in the off season to give you the skills to be able to do so.
Flashing back to that national championship, where were you at that moment?
That moment I was in the stands. And I remember, watching, but feeling, right? In myself, tracking the racing thoughts, tracking those racing emotions, and wondering what was going on for them. So then afterwards, to be able to hear from them directly about the ways that they were able to embed it in a way that was natural and smooth and seamless, was the sort of moment that I really knew, okay, like we're onto something here. Like this is something we can do, that athletes can use, that is going to support them in pursuing championships. And of course, that's a skill set that can support them long after their athletic careers, are done.
Well, what you describe, the fear, the ambiguity, the worry, I subscribe a lot to the concept of our minds are primed for what our ancestors experienced way, way back in the day, right? The fear, the ambiguity, the worry, that might have been, I'm afraid that a lion is going to come kill me in my cave. So, of course, if your life is in danger, you're going to have heart palpitations, your palms are going to sweat, you will react with that fight or flight response. In the modern age, we don't have that, right? As stressful as a national championship point is, your life is not at risk. So you don't have to have that fight or flight response, and meditation and mindfulness practice is a way to refocus our minds so that we're not running for our lives.
Absolutely. But the thing is, Sam, that our biological hardware, the stuff we were given in our nervous systems, doesn't discern if it's a lion chasing us or if it's a national championship point. It reacts all the same. And so that reaction isn't a problem. That's normal. That's adaptive. Like our nervous system just does it. And there are points in our modern life where we still need that, right? There might be a situation where we need to friggin' run, right? So we need to have that capacity. What the mindfulness does, to your point, is it allows us to recognize that as it's happening and then discern, oh, I don't need to follow this any further. I can shift my attention. I can shift to a more helpful nervous system state and then execute the moment that's ahead of me.
Chad, you're accomplishing some amazing things at Wisconsin, and a few times during this podcast, you've done a great job broadening it, and because my audience, mean, maybe I'm sure some Wisconsin people will listen to hear you, but most of them are not student athletes. Most of them are out doing other things, whether it's sports or just their own business lives. So what's a little nugget of advice you want to share with my audience before I let you go?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think I just appreciate just that note of, I mean, I enjoy working with all sorts of folks, business folks, tactical folks, sport folks. So I just enjoy being in those environments. And there's something around, we've all got a mind, we've all got a body, and especially in performance context, we're all trying to, perform at a high level in the moments that matter most. So the details may be different in the boardroom versus the national championship court, but the fundamental skills that allow us to do that are oftentimes quite similar. So I'd say like a nugget though that comes to mind is that it doesn't have to be like a full life makeover to benefit from this training, right? We don't need a complex morning protocol of, and I'm not anti people waking up early and getting in the cold tub and getting a little sunlight early in the morning, right? Like that's great, right? But just find simple, easy ways to start to develop these skills. And in the end, it's going to be short moments many times that train the mind. The mind's constantly being trained. This is the insight of neuroplasticity. The question is, who's in charge of what's being trained? And so when we take responsibility throughout our lives to train like for things like attention, stability, authentic connection, in short ways, then ultimately we're establishing a new baseline for how we show up in the world.
Short moments many times. That can apply to so many things in life. And I hope that you, the listener at home, can take a little something from that, right? Whether we're talking about mindfulness training or anything, it's the short moments many times. They add up and they are our lives.
Absolutely.
Beautiful thing. Chad, beautiful to follow your work. I'm sure in, what was the year, 2100, we'll be talking mind reading, but for now it's about mindfulness training. You're accomplishing great things at Wisconsin. Can't wait to read some of the research that continues to come out. That truly is groundbreaking stuff. So thank you for coming on. You are a superstar. My mom went to Wisconsin, so I root for the Badgers always. I will give you a hearty on Wisconsin.
There we go. On Wisconsin. Thanks, Sam. Thanks for the conversation.
Hey, back here in the studio, what a rich, awesome conversation with Chad McGehee. A lot of people come through the walls of the Mental Game podcast, and everyone's great for different reasons. What makes Chad such an awesome guest, he's so kind, Midwestern hospitality, obviously, but also he takes these really complex concepts and research, and he puts them into stories and bite-sized pieces of advice that I know are helpful for his athletes, and I know are also helpful for us here on the Mental Game. So big thank you to Chad for the awesome chat. I'm sure we'll have him for a third time in the not-so-distant future. But to you, I always thank you for joining the Mental Game. Thank you in advance for liking and subscribing. If you could take a moment to do that, that does help a great deal. Also, a reminder that this podcast is sponsored in part by the Lasers Ladybug Society, a wonderful charity in the DMV area run by good friends of ours, John and Renee Laser. They're raising all sorts of money for all sorts of causes in the mental health space, and I hope you'll support them at the link in the description. But for now, I'm Sam Brief, imploring you to treat yourself and others well, and I'll talk to you next time on the Mental Game Podcast. Goodbye from Chicago.